Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Ethical Theory, 50 Puzzles, Paradoxes, and Thought Experiments. Puzzles, Paradoxes, and Thought Experiments in Philosophy. By Daniel Muñoz and Sarah Stroud. Narrated by Ellie Gossage. Introduction. Ethical theory asks some big, lofty, ancient questions. What makes for a good life? Which kinds of actions are right and which are wrong? Are we morally responsible agents or mere puppets of our own desires? These questions are so big, so lofty, and so ancient that it's sometimes hard to know where to start. That's where this book comes in. Our goal is to get you thinking about some of the deepest questions in ethics using 3 engaging and intuitive methods: puzzles, paradoxes, and thought experiments. Over the course of 11 chapters, we dip into 50 cases and conundrums, with each a few questions for discussion. You'll find lots of certifiable classics. Plato's Ring of Gyges, number 36. Parfit's Repugnant Conclusion, number 50. Thompson's Trolley Problem, number 6, and so forth. But we've also prioritized variety, and we hope that even experts will find at least 1 or 2 new puzzles to savor. That said, this book is very much written as an introduction. It is also supposed to be enjoyable to listen to. Don't think of this as 50 encyclopedia entries. Instead of laying out the state of scholarly debate, these chapters are trying to get you intrigued, to spark your own interesting questions, hypotheses, and insights. Many entries include responses from philosophers trying to solve this or that paradox, but we leave the last word to the listener. We hope that the book will be useful in undergraduate moral philosophy courses, either as a source of standalone sections or as a supplement to primary sources. But you don't have to be a philosophy major, much less a philosophy professor, to understand this book. Each chapter and even each entry can be listened to completely on its own. That said, we have tried to note some of the more important connections between different entries, and we have tried to give the book a kind of thematic arc. We start, Chapter 1, with the most wonderfully simple theory of them all, utilitarianism, which says that we should always do what promotes the greatest happiness for all. After considering some of the classic counterexamples, we then turn to utilitarianism's traditional rival, deontology, which has its own tricky cases to deal with, Chapter 2, as well as more conceptual puzzles, Chapters 3 through 4. The middle of the book adds in a little of that human touch, partiality towards loved ones, Chapter 5, and the components of a good life, Chapter 6. From there, we embark on an adventure into more abstract issues having to do with the logic and psychology of morality, tragic dilemmas, Chapter 7, moral motivation, Chapter 8, the nature of moral responsibility, Chapter 9, and the significance of factual and moral uncertainty, Chapter 10. Finally, we turn towards the future, Chapter 11. Conscious robots, the end of humanity, and the kind of world we should want for future generations. Ethical theory, ancient and abstruse though it may be, is awesome. There are not many things in the world that are so fascinating and yet so close to everyday life. We hope that this book leaves you at least a little more fascinated than you were before. Chapter 1. Utility and Consequences. Suppose you had a decision to make in your life. It could be a big decision, where to go to college, what career to aim for, or a more minor decision, like how to spend the weekend. What would you base your decision on? Is it possible to characterize the criteria we use when we make choices in absolutely general terms? One compelling general answer, which seems to apply equally to both big and small decisions, is that you would decide based on which option you think would work out best. In other words, you would look into the future and try to imagine how things would go if you chose this college, or that career, or those weekend activities. If you could see that a certain choice now would cause you unhappiness now or later, you would likely steer clear of that option. you would instead select the option that seems to lead to the most happiness down the road. A prominent ethical theory takes this method of individual decision-making and applies it to moral decisions. According to utilitarianism, the morally right choice in any situation is whichever option will lead to the most happiness overall. There is admittedly one big difference between the individual case and the moral case. When you are deciding just for yourself, it's only your own happiness that you consider. But when you are making a moral decision, it is the happiness of everyone concerned that you should take into account. Utilitarianism sees morality as an important counterweight to our tendency to care only about ourselves, and perhaps a few other select people. For moral purposes, it insists each person's happiness must count equally. We can sum up this simple version of utilitarianism as follows. An action is morally right if and only if it leads to the greatest total happiness of all the options available to you. It is morally wrong to choose anything else. And when tallying up total happiness or utility, every unit of happiness counts the same, regardless of whose happiness it is. In other words, utilitarianism is fundamentally impartial. For utilitarianism, the moral status of an action is a function, indeed solely a function, of its outcome or consequences. For this reason, utilitarianism is often viewed as one specific version of a broader category of ethical theories, called consequentialism. Consequentialist theories all demand that we perform the action with the best consequences, impartiality considered. But they might have a different view than utilitarianism does on the question of which consequences are best. For example, a non-utilitarian consequentialist theory might hold that both total happiness and equality make consequences better. Utilitarianism seems like a highly intuitive and logical ethical theory, but we present a number of puzzles in this chapter which suggest that it is neither as appealing nor as straightforward as it seems. In number 1, George and the bioweapons, we look at a person who has to make a decision which we would have thought purely personal. But utilitarianism has its own opinion about what he should, indeed must, do. Entries 2 to 4 consider some of the odder aspects of making decisions guided solely by total happiness. The utility monster, number 2, presents a monster whose happiness prevails in every utility calculation. Parfit's harmless torturers, number 3, argues that a group can do something horribly wrong even if every single individual in it acts rightly, according to utilitarianism. And number 4, infinite utility shows how weird things get when you allow infinite quantities of utility into the picture. As number 1 also did, the World Cup accident, case in number 5, shows the disastrous effects that a utilitarian calculation of total happiness can have for a lone individual. Philosopher T.M. Scanlon, who created the example, uses it to motivate his strongly anti-utilitarian model of moral decisions when some people will benefit and others will be harmed. 1. George and the bioweapons. George is a chemist who is having severe trouble finding a suitable job. He is very anxious about this situation, not least because he has a spouse and kids who are relying on him for support, and his health problems are worsening under the stress. He is grateful when an older chemist who is familiar with the difficulties George is having says she may be able to pull some strings and throw a job his way. There's only one catch. The job is in a lab which develops chemical and biological weapons, CBW. If George took the job, his remit would be to create bigger and better versions of such weapons. Everything in George shrinks from the idea of working in the field of CBW. He is deeply and instinctually opposed to chemical and biological warfare. He considers it beyond the pale to even contemplate unleashing chemical and biological agents on human beings. For George, that is a line that should never be crossed. When he conveys his strong opposition to the older chemist, she replies that she's not a particular fan of CBW either, But she adds if George does not get the job, she thinks she knows who will. That other chemist, she says, is a real keener, and he's not deterred by any moral qualms about CBW. He will work so enthusiastically at the job that he is likely to make even more progress on new CBW weaponry than George would. In fact, she explains, she's suggesting the job to George not just out of concern for George, but also in order to keep that fellow from getting the position. What should George do? Bernard Williams introduces this example not in order to defend a particular answer to this question, but to demonstrate that the utilitarian answer to it is inadequate. The utilitarian maintains that the right thing to do in any situation is whatever will lead to the largest possible total of human happiness. Let's assume that developing bigger and better CBW is likely to greatly diminish total human happiness. Then the conclusion is simple. That outcome simply must be prevented, to the extent one can. There is one exception, if the only way to prevent it is to do something that would be even worse for overall happiness. In this case, the other fellow getting the job will move us closer to that bad outcome, unless George intervenes. So, from a utilitarian perspective, it is clearly George's duty to step in and prevent the keener from getting the job by taking it himself. Among the factors that do not play a prominent role in the utilitarian's reasoning is the fact that by taking the job, George would be devoting his life to something which he deems abhorrent, and which runs counter to all he believes in and stands for. On top of having to spend 40 hours a week designing ever more destructive chemical weapons, he'd have to find a way to live with himself the rest of the time. It seems it might destroy George as the person he is to follow this path. But utilitarianism, it appears, hardly cares. In fairness, utilitarianism does consider the harms to George when it dictates which course of action he must follow. It also considers the benefits, such as having a job and therefore being able to support his family. But these are only minor factors in the utilitarian's reasoning, because they are dwarfed by the differing impacts on humanity as a whole of the more vigorous versus the less vigorous pursuit of next-gen CBW weapons. If one person is made miserable by having to work in a CBW lab, that is, after all, pretty small beans from the point of view of the universe. This example effectively brings out a more general moral, that utilitarianism generates what we might call an unlimited requirement of prevention. According to utilitarianism, whenever there is some bad state of affairs that you could prevent, it is morally wrong of you not to prevent it, unless you could do even more good from an impartial standpoint by doing something else instead. In other words, if you are in a position to forestall some bad outcome, you must interrupt whatever you are doing to forestall it. There is one exception, which we will discuss in the next paragraph. Note that this requirement does not depend on you being the sole person who can prevent this bad outcome. If there are many people in a position to prevent it, it is equally incumbent on each of them to drop what they are doing and prevent it. Once one of them does, of course, the ethical situation changes, since the danger has now receded. The only exception to this unlimited requirement of prevention is when whatever you are doing instead is so beneficial to human happiness that you are obligated to continue doing it. But this is unlikely in the case of poor George. If he rejects this job, he might eventually end up using his chemistry training to work on dishwashing detergent or some other innocuous thing instead. We can charitably grant that this might modestly advance total human happiness. But from a utilitarian perspective, it is far more important that he block the CBW advances which the keener is likely to make. If George's situation is a dilemma, it is not one for the utilitarian. A non-utilitarian might think the aforementioned outlook turns each of us essentially into a servant of the greater good. Rather than living our own lives, we must instead be a kind of first responder to potential disasters not of our own making, on call 24 hours a day. And we are expected to play this role even when the response we are called upon to make runs counter to our own values and moral convictions. Williams points out that this stance contravenes the idea of integrity, or living in a way that exemplifies and harmonizes with who you most fundamentally are. He concludes that utilitarianism makes integrity as a value more or less unintelligible. Questions for reflection. 1. What might a plausible limited requirement of prevention look like? 2. Do you think integrity in William's sense is a value that morality must accommodate? What about the integrity of a bad person with bad ends? 2. The utility monster. Take a moment to think of a truly, undeniably terrible ethical view. What comes to mind? You might be thinking of a noxious ideology, like Nazi anti-Semitism, white supremacy, or sexist beliefs about the proper role of women. Or maybe you were thinking of everyday jerks, like the narcissist who sees himself as the center of the universe. One thing terrible views almost always have in common is that they are deeply committed to inequality. The sexist man thinks that men matter more than women, just as the narcissist thinks that he matters more than everyone else. So it's no wonder that utilitarians love to emphasize that their view, in a crucial sense, treats people as equals. For the utilitarian, what matters is total utility, the sum of everybody's happiness. Because everyone's utility counts the same towards the total, everybody matters equally. If you're choosing between a big benefit to one person or small benefit to another, you have to give the bigger benefit, no matter the race, sex, or religion of anyone involved. Utilitarians are therefore deeply opposed to saying that anyone's utility matters more than anybody else's. To use a slogan from Derek Parfit, each counts for one. The slogan does, by universal admission, sound cool, but critics worry that utilitarianism is still embarrassed by a subtler way in which it approves of inequalities. This problem pops out most dramatically when we imagine a certain kind of imaginary creature. A utility monster is a being who receives enormously greater gains of utility from any sacrifice of others than these others lose. The worry is that utilitarianism seems to require that we all be sacrificed in the monster's maw. To illustrate, suppose your friend Sally would enjoy eating a sandwich. Should you take away Sally's sandwich and give it to the utility monster? According to utilitarianism, yes. Whatever enjoyment Sally gets from the sandwich, we're supposed to imagine that the monster gets vastly more enjoyment. Think of the utility monster as the world's most efficient utility generator. However much utility you might create by giving a resource to somebody, that will always pale in comparison to the awesome sums of utility you would generate by just giving the goods to the monster instead. So, of course, the sandwich should be snatched from Sally, along with everybody else's sandwiches, and indeed all other goodies of any kind. In fact, there is no end to the sacrifices that we have to make to the utility monster. Think about it. Even if Sally is loving her life, and even if she would hate to be eaten, we can imagine that the utility monster would really, really love to eat Sally and would really, really hate it if we kept her away. In this way, the utility monster's utility comes to trump Sally's, along with anybody else's. Thus, we should all be flung into the monster's maw. In this way, utilitarianism can favor even the most unequal distributions of utility. Here, the utility monster gets everything. We get nothing. But utilitarianism still, in a sense, counts the monster itself as the equal of anybody else. The monster's utility doesn't get special weight. The monster only gets the goods because it always has, objectively, the most to gain or lose. Think of it like this. If Sally gets 1 utility point from her sandwich, the utility monster gets 2. That's why it gets the sandwich. Not because 1 point for the utility monster counts for double, but because its 2 points count for twice as much as Sally's single point. Everyone's utility matters equally, in a sense, but the result is that utility is distributed in a totally unequal way. Summing things up, utilitarians believe in one kind of equality, which we can call the principle of equal weight. A certain amount of utility matters the same no matter who enjoys it. But this leads them to deny, in a spectacular fashion, another attractive kind of equality, which we might call the principle of equal distribution. It's better, at least in one way, if people's utility levels are closer to being equal. If we are against a distribution that gives everything to the monster, we can't be utilitarians. Responses. Not so fast. Before we draw any big conclusions, we have to ask if the monster is really as embarrassing as it initially seems. To start, does the idea of a utility monster even make sense? For the thought experiment to work, the monster must be capable of enjoying mind-boggling amounts of utility, more than the rest of the world combined, and all within the slender confines of a single life. Is that really possible? If not, and there is an upper limit to any being's utility, then the utility monster may turn out to be a harmless boogeyman, made up to scare impressionable ethics students. This reply has some force. If the monster is supposed to be a kind of higher being whose pleasures outclass ours just as ours outclass the crude pleasures of lobsters, then utilitarians can respond that such a being is impossible. But that's just one kind of monster. It's easier to imagine a monster who is just like a human, only much longer lived. Then it seems we can perfectly appreciate the problem. Suppose that humanity, as a collective, stands to enjoy a net total of 10 quintillion years of pleasure. Then we can imagine a choice. Either humanity enjoys that pleasure, or we sacrifice everyone to the utility monster, who then enjoys 100 quintillion years of pleasure. The utilitarian has to say, sacrifice everyone. But this seems, for lack of a better word, monstrous. What can utilitarians say for themselves? Strategy number 1. Try to show that helping the utility monster isn't as monstrous as it seems. Notice that 100 quintillion years is a long, long time. Perhaps we are reticent to side with the monster simply because we can't wrap our minds around the sheer length of the pleasures it will feel. Some utilitarians will say a similar thing about the sheer intensity of pleasure felt by the higher being version of the monster. But if we're unable to appreciate big numbers, why are we so sure that it's better for the many, many non-monsters to enjoy their quintillions of years of pleasure? Strategy number 2. Try to show that the monster is a problem for everyone. Consider, for example, the egalitarian, who thinks that equal distribution matters. The egalitarian may think that equality sometimes matters more than total utility, but surely it doesn't always matter more. If a kid falls and breaks her nose, we shouldn't all break our noses just to keep things even. But if total utility can sometimes outweigh equality, then why not in the case of the utility monster, where forsaking the monster massively decreases the total utility the world could have had? And a version of that question faces almost everyone in ethical theory. Whether you are a utilitarian, egalitarian, or deontologist, if you think that total utility is even part of what matters, you are going to have to grapple with the monster. Sacrificing to the monster is, of course, a sacrifice. Something is lost. The puzzle is to explain why the things we stand to lose should matter more than the awesome, monstrous amount of utility we stand to gain. Questions for reflection. 1. In this section, we have been talking about total utilitarianism, which, as you'd guess, tells us to maximize total utility. But consider future average utilitarianism, which tells us to maximize the average utility of those who exist after our action is complete. Would this view also recommend sacrificing to the monster? What about timeless average utilitarianism, which tells us to maximize the average level of utility among people who ever did or will exist? 2. We have been considering a positive utility monster, on whom we can bestow many years of pleasant life. But there could also be a negative utility monster whom we can rescue from many years of horrible torture. Chapel, 2021. For example, suppose that we can save the monster from 100 quintillion years of torture by depriving humanity of its future, which would contain 10 quintillion years of pleasure. Do you think we should help the negative utility monster? Can you think of any reasons for helping the negative utility monster that don't also count in favor of helping the positive utility monster? 3. In our discussion, we were often talking about pleasure and utility as though they were the same thing, but you might think that there is more to life than pleasure: knowledge, friendship, achievement, love, and so on. If you believe in these sorts of goods beyond pleasure, Is it still plausible that a solitary being could have a better life than the rest of humanity combined? Why or why not? 3. Parfit's harmless torturers. Sometimes a group of people can do something awful, like voting in a tyrant or wrecking their environment, even though no individual in the group makes a decisive difference. When this happens, let's call it a collective action problem. For an ethical theorist, collective action problems are puzzling. On the one hand, they are clearly problems. On the other hand, it's often unclear who is the problem. Sometimes no individual seems to be at fault. To illustrate this puzzling duality, Derek Parfit, 1984, came up with a pair of unforgettable thought experiments. Back in the bad old days, there were 1,000 victims, each of whom started the day with a mild pain. For each victim, there was a torturer, who had his own switch. When a torturer turned the switch, his victim's pain would be increased by a small amount, too small to be perceptible. But each torturer turned his switch 1,000 times, with the result that every victim spent the day in agony. Here we have a bad collective action. But it's obvious that we can blame the individuals. Everyone's a torturer. Contrast that with the harmless torturers. It's like the bad old days, but with a twist. Instead of turning a switch 1,000 times, each torturer presses a button that turns all 1,000 switches one time. Here we have the same bad result, 1,000 people being tortured. But this time, how could we possibly blame anyone? No individual does any torturing, since no one makes his victims perceptibly worse off. Individually, they are harmless. Together, they are torturers. That's a shocking paradox. Our ethical theories, applied to certain collective actions, let people get away with torture. Worse, lots of real collective action problems seem a lot like Parfit's torturers. Take air pollution. Together, the world emits so many billions of tons of CO2 that we are literally raising sea levels. But when you drive your car, you barely emit a few kilograms. Your emissions seem diffuse and imperceptible, like harmless torture. You might conclude that you don't have to worry about your contribution, but by that reasoning, no one has to worry, and we will all suffer. Responses. There are 2 ways out of this problem. 1. Show that each harmless torturer does something wrong after all. 2. Show that real collective action problems aren't like harmless torture. Let's start with the torturers themselves. Is there a way for us to blame them? A natural thought is that each is responsible for his share of the harm that they do together, which means each of the 1,000 torturers is responsible for one victim's torture, just like in the bad old days. But this share of the total view can't possibly be right, as Parfit shows with another pair of examples in the first rescue mission. 100 miners are trapped, and at least 4 people are needed for a rescue mission. 4 volunteers are already on their way. You can either join them as a 5th or go single-handedly rescue another 10 miners elsewhere. What should you do? The share of the total view says to join the team, since you'll get credit for saving 20 lives. Your share is 1/5 of 100. But then only 100 survive rather than 110. Here, the share of the total view overrates participating in collective actions. The view also sometimes underrates it in the second rescue mission. The 100 miners are trapped as before, but this time the rescue mission will require 5 people. You can either join the big mission as the 5th, or go off to single-handedly rescue 50 others, a mission that needs only 1 person. Here, the share of the total view says you should save the 50 alone, since you would get credit for saving 20 if you joined the team. But then only 50 survive rather than 100. So much for sharing. Another way to blame a harmless torturer is to say that even imperceptible pains are bad. They still, according to Parfit's definition, make a difference to how their victims feel. It's just a difference that the victim can't reliably detect, like how you can't notice subtle shifts in a violin's pitch. This seems like a fair point. But even if 1,000 tiny pains are bad, how bad could they be? None of the 1,000 victims can even notice the difference. Even if the harmless torturer's acts aren't harmless, that doesn't show that they're even remotely comparable to torture, which means that there isn't much blame to go around.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?